I'm talking today with Adam Pleiman. In addition to being an awesome recording engineer here at Sound Images, Adam has worked extensively in corporate theater. I've not had that much experience in live sound other than doing a church gig every Sunday, but for several years you worked for a company called Prestige Audio. Tell me a bit about what a typical job, if there was such a thing, was like.
Well, thanks for calling me an awesome engineer. But the typical job, it ranged there. The company itself started off as a rental company, renting projectors and like small PAs and things like that, and like wireless microphones to the hotel guests and people who had conferences. But once you start to grow your customer base, they end up asking for more things, and you start needing creative and you start needing full-on production. So they moved kind of into the world of what would be like the business theater stuff. So basically it would end up being a large PA, the size of something at Riverbend, something like 16 boxes a side, line array, dangle. It would be a massive PA like that with possibly like one person speaking to a podium to a lot of people. The typical production was always a different place. It was always a different show, always a different crowd size. I think my max was like 12,000 people I did.
Wow.
In an arena for one guy talking. And then down to the small stuff where it's 20 people, but they still have like a stage and a PA. But the majority of it was somewhere in the middle, a couple thousand people. Always a lighting rig, always nice PA. And basically in that situation, everything fell on your shoulders, from building the PA in the room to running the show to taking it down.
That's it. I mean, you not only had to run the show, but also rig it. I imagine that created some really long work days. How long did you have to get there before the show started to get set up?
It depends on how big the show was. A lot of times it was a day or two. Most of the time it was a day. A lot of times you'd come in early morning or show up the night before set that whole day, probably have a tech rehearsal that night and following morning show or rehearsal that morning and be show ready by the end of that set day. There's some shows that are big enough that would be a couple days of setup. That was pretty extensive. The one thing that Prestige prided itself with was North America's largest rear projection screen. It was 120 feet wide.
Wow.
By like 30 feet tall.
An IMAX.
Yeah, it was a pretty cool piece, and it was a real treat to see. I mean, because it could be a really wide stage and have a video backdrop of HD video, so really useful, really neat thing. But setting something up like that, you're talking 8 or 9 projectors on scaffolding behind it that all get tweaked into the pixel. So just that alone will eat up a day to get that up, and quite a bit of crew. Then think about PA and rigging everything else. So they got some pretty big sets.
Were you in charge of the video too, or basically just the audio?
No, I was all audio. I learned a lot of video from that job. I didn't go in there knowing all the stuff that I knew about video. You get forced into situations where you have to pick up the slack on something, and well, I've got a brain and I've got, 2 hands. Let's see if I can't figure it out. So a lot of times the production managers would say, you're on audio for this. Here's the layout of the room, and then you'd get a big blueprint or something with all the rigging points and with your stage on it and say, where do you want your PA? Here's where the seats are. Here's where the people are. Here's the PA you're bringing. And it would be up to me to then kind of grid out everything. The dispersion of your PA, how many boxes you have per side. And we had all JBL stuff. We were a JBL dealer, so we had a JBL Vertec and the VRX boxes. So you knew your dispersion, you had to dangle them. And luckily JBL has some pretty useful software that you can figure out basically all your angles and have the math done for you by them, but you still have to figure out how you really are going to hit all those people.
Well, you had to spend, I guess, a lot of time in pre-production. I mean, were you actually out there measuring with tape measures to see?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. You were calling it white gloving, when the mixer doesn't also have to do the rigging, when you can just kind of walk in and step behind the console and run the show.
Best gig in the world.
Yeah. How often did you get to do that?
Very seldom.
I bet.
Well, we were a non-union house, so the only times you really got to white glove it was if you had to use their equipment and you weren't allowed to touch it.
Mm-hmm.
So that didn't happen very often. We had one show in the Bahamas. It's pretty expensive to fly our PA and all our equipment down there. So we set up that a local company provided the equipment and we provided the personnel. And so when we showed up, we weren't exactly sure if we were going to be setting up the gear, if I was going to be flying a PA or anything. We weren't 100% sure, but it's awful nice when you're in a place like the Bahamas and you walk into your room and find out that everything's done and all you have to do is make sure that it's done right, and then you can walk out and go to the beach and have a gin and tonic.
Sweet gig.
Yeah. Wasn't half bad.
Production sound mixer Jeff Maxwell talked about the problems with wireless mics. You once told me you worked a corporate show in Vegas, I think, that was running in the same complex as 2 other live shows, all using multiple wireless mics. Now, with the ever-shrinking amount of wireless bandwidth available, what did you do to make sure that you didn't have conflicts with the other shows?
Oh, you got to be really nice to everybody around you.
Yeah, I bet.
First off is if you see that they have a show going live, if there's a show going on, I had just a bunch of Shure Wireless that I had networked together, so I typically had anywhere between like 10 and 16 wireless running at a time. I had all my network together. I could do a scan and it would find 16 free frequencies. But that still doesn't make sure that you're safe because, what if another show somewhere else is going on and they're not on? So I would make a list of all my frequencies that I want to use or all the ones that showed up right. And sure, it does the nice, group and channel thing where if you're in group 1, all the channels in group 1 work well together. So if I notice one group has a lot of open frequencies, I would then write all those down and write down like group 1, channel whatever, and then the actual frequency and make my list, make a couple copies of it, and then actually go to all the shows around me and say, hey guys, I'm in this room. I don't want to walk on any of your frequencies. Here's my chart. Would you be able to make one of these up for me in case I have a problem? I'll be able to get around it. That's the nice way, and that's the way to keep friends. The other way is to risk it and hope that you're more powerful and make enemies, and that's no way of doing it. And it ends up biting you anyway, because if you are on the same frequency of anybody, no one's winning that battle. It's just everyone loses.
You were talking about the technique of ringing out mics.
Yeah.
And that's essentially feedback tuning. Explain how that's done and what the benefit of doing that is.
Yeah, well, for these situations, it's a little different. Like in a band situation, I would do this completely different. Not completely different, but I approach it differently. So if you're thinking about like a band on a stage, there's a lot of dynamic mics, very few condensers, and a lot of loud things happening. So you can get away with very little work there. But if you were to take that same situation in an arena with a person with like a condenser lavalier on and have them just talk to the crowd very softly, you're going to end up running into so many issues. That's my biggest challenge, but the biggest learning curve is how to deal with someone who needs to speak softly to like 12,000 people. I approached it from the whole PA standpoint, knowing that I'm going to be playing like a CD, maybe a couple video rolls. I've got stereo feeds that aren't mic'd, and the only mics that are going up are like a couple condensers on the podium and then a couple, lavalier condensers. So basically, I would take all my mics, get the PA sounding normal first, get it sounding right. You have to tune it to the room, tune your PA, EQ it to, if you want to run pink noise or white noise through it and actually adjust to make it flat, yeah, you can do that. Or you can just listen to your favorite song and EQ it till your song sounds right, whichever way you choose. Once it sounds right, get your lav up there and start talking into it. It never sounds right. It always requires some sort of work. They're always pretty thin or sound a little tubey or something. It's not a mic that's pointed directly at somebody's mouth, so it's not going to sound great. You can hack some frequencies out and get it to sound close. Now, is it loud enough? That's the next question. Great, it sounds good, but really, let's talk about 12,000 bodies in the room shuffling around. You're going to be able to hear this over the PA. I mean, I'd shoot for around like 90 dB at mix position beforehand, and in an empty room, that seems like entirely too much. But once you get people in there, you're still wanting to push more and more. Me coming kind of from a rock and roll background, moving into that, I think I always set my bar a little high on how loud it should be and what's acceptable. So typically I ended up being all right when it comes to people hearing stuff. But once you get a lav up there and you start turning it up to what you think is the reasonable level for that room, it's going to take off.
You say take off, you mean feedback, right?
Feedback, yeah. So basically you just identify that frequency. You figure out what that frequency is. If my cheat was, and I think I should probably stop using it so I can start identifying frequencies just by ear, was on my iPhone. I had a cheap RTA that I could get a ballpark of where it was and then seek and destroy. Oh yeah, it's awesome. I don't know how accurate the mic is, but it got me like close-ish. But you could identify problems in the room. So if each mic is always taken off at the same spot, and everybody's all around that area, you might want to just go ahead and take your graph on the room and notch that out. And hopefully you don't have to do too terribly much because you just did all that work on the graph to make it sound good in that room anyway. What I've done, though, rather than touching the room's EQ, which is probably the wrong way, is we used a lot of digital consoles where I could run all of the lavaliers out one channel. I could put a graph on that channel, or I could use the parametric on that.
Like grouping all the then just doing one group EQ for
exactly.
everything.
So that I could just grab the problem frequencies there and start hacking them out. And it was always like a 50-50 sort of trade-off because you didn't really want to kill everything completely, or else you're just going to end up slaughtering the sound of that mic, and you're going to end up having something that just doesn't sound normal. So it's this fine line you walk between cutting the frequencies completely out and the amount of gain you want to use. And typically you can find where that sweet spot is.
Yeah, I had a Behringer feedback destroyer. When you actually did the feedback tuning and then you listened to what something actually sounded like through that, it was like pretty strange. But I've noticed that usually is the easiest way to get feedback when somebody's talking very low and you're trying to goose the mic up so you can hear them. And suddenly it's too late and you have feedback. Is getting feedback a capital crime for a front of house mixer? Are they fired? immediately?
corporate, yes. Yeah, there's been guys, and it was unfortunate. I was on a show. I was not mixing. I was the assistant. So sitting backstage, honestly, in the A2 is making sure that everything that is audio that is not at front of house happens. So miking people up, which is a little intrusive at times. Your hands down their shirt, or you're trying to figure out a way to clip a mic to some lady's bra strap, or there's too many stories, some of them that were just hilarious about weird things people were okay with. But they make nice like body straps for people to get belt packs on. But I've definitely had my hand put places on people that I wish had not happened doing that. But so at this one show, there's a good audio guy. He was hired by the company, freelancer. He was white gloving it, so just showing up and mixing. And we had everything set up. He showed up and I gave him the rundown of the PA and the rig that we had set up for him. He then took like 6 hours, rang out the room, like really took his time ringing it out. And next morning we come in and one of the people gets up, they start talking, and the first person to get up was real low. I guess he rang out the room, didn't expect to need to get this loud. He brought it up in the PA, feeds back, he fixes it shortly thereafter. The rest of the show went fine. We never saw him ever again. Then we talked to our client, who was the guy who hired him. After that, this guy apologized up and down. He's like, sorry about that. I guess I wasn't ready for the level I needed. And he's like, oh, well, okay. And at the end of it, the client was like, we won't be seeing him again. Like, oh, man. So what was unfortunate is he lost the gig. What was fortunate is I got it.
Yeah.
So, yeah, you don't mess up. If you need to spend the whole night, don't sleep if you don't need to get the room right, to get it ready, because you'll lose that. I mean, the people paying the bill on the whole thing are the people standing on stage talking, and if you make them look like a moron, you're not going to be there again.
Yeah, I've heard stories like this from Belgian TV or some Scandinavian company where they said, yeah, if you get feedback on anything like that, they were immediately fired.
Yeah,
it's
that's
like,
it.
Gosh.
Because you should be able to circumvent that. You should be able to make sure that you're not going to be in that situation. And if it is really outlandish, that somebody really throws you a curveball last minute that is going to put you in a situation like that, the best thing you could possibly do is to tell them, hey, this is going to be a problem. Here's what the problem is going to be. This is your warning. We can't do it this way. And if they say go ahead and do it anyway, make your stand politely and then try to do your best to make it not happen. And the best thing that could happen in that situation is you figure it out. The worst doesn't happen. You don't mess anything up. You come through looking like the guy who was the naysayer, but still nothing went wrong. Better that than things blowing up and everybody looking bad.
You were telling me one time you had some musicians with clip-on mics that actually were walking around on stage and they were walking in front of speakers. And...
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a horn section. It was like roaming the audience. And they had clip-on mics, and they would walk directly in front of the PA speakers. They just hang out there for a while. And they came back and complained that they weren't hearing themselves out of the PA. And like, well... It's a good reason for that, because the people you're playing to, you're 5 feet away from, and you're directly in front of the PA. So I see two reasons why I'm not raising you up in the PA. You sound great, by the way, though, guys. You're having a really good night.
There you go. Yeah, complimenting works great. How many rehearsals did you typically have for a show?
Sometimes 3, sometimes absolutely none. None is very scary. But, these things are all scripted. For the most part, they're scripted, if not technically scripted. So at least we know what we're doing on our end, who's going up when, what mic needs to be hot when. But there's a lot of shows that are dependent on automation and video rolls and long stretches of timed things that need to be rehearsed. And there was one group that we did work in Vegas that we would rehearse 4 or 5 times before we got up there. And we'd finally go day of show. And I think they just liked either to give people heart attacks or they just could never commit to anything, because we'd do rehearsals. And then there was one year that I had a 30-minute mark, that 30 minutes outside a show, there's no turning back. We have to go live in 30 minutes. So here we go. We're all cool. And everyone got their standbys. Everyone gave it the green light. We went. And a minute before they were supposed to hit the stage, someone went off and went to the bathroom or something. And so this is like lighting and audio, everything video synced, that it's all going to go through. And then suddenly someone's like, no, we have to delay. And it's like, we have to back out of this, go to like our plan B, which was far less cool than plan A, and probably looked fine to the audience, but
it wasn't what it could have been.
It wasn't like this sweet lighting thing or this great video. It's like, oh, everyone backs out to just like what would have been like this great opening then became kind of out of context. And
well, at least he didn't have his wireless mic on in the bathroom. That would have been a...
No, well, they do, but I've got it muted.
Yeah. Did you ever have conflicts or issues with the local stagehands unions?
No, you got to go by the rules. If it's a union house and you need to have one union guy for every 9 non-union guy there, that's what you got to do. And, you know that going into it. And some places are a little more relaxed than others. Some of them just require a shadow who doesn't need to touch anything, or some places require, someone who does everything themselves, and then you're the shadow who
do that,
yeah,
and they do
which
it.
Isn't bad, but in my mind, I know my gear a lot better. I know what I'm doing. I've wrapped my head around it for the past couple months, so I can probably really go through and get it done quick. But then when you start to need to manage people to do it and teach them exactly how something goes, it takes a little bit longer. But if you really know what's going on, you can keep a couple hands pretty busy. And especially if they're qualified guys, half the time you don't even need to do anything. But it's the towns that don't have qualified guys doing that kind of work that just really makes it drag.
Yeah. You mentioned that in addition to rigging and running the shows, you were also involved in the load in, the load out, and even driving the truck across the country. I mean, when did you get a chance to sleep?
When I first got there, I was driving. The reason I took the corporate gig is I'd been driving backline for bands across the country to fill the gaps between sessions in the studio. So we'd go like a month of sessions in the studio and then have some time off and need something to fill the time. I'd pick up a truck of gear, drive it to Louisiana, and drop it off for a band, make sure nothing blew up, fixed it if it did, and came back. So then I'm like, I'm kind of done with this traveling thing. I'm going to go work at a corporate place. And it turns out to be like more traveling than before. But I made a hard stand early on that I didn't want to drive. That's just my thing. I don't want to drive anymore, even though I knew how to do log books and all the commercial stuff like that. We're always in short trucks, 24, 26 footers, nothing, no semis, nothing, no CDL required sort of things. I did need a medical card. So you'd leave however many days before you need to. Typically get there the night before you're supposed to set up. Possibly my most interesting and most terrible 2 weeks ever, but flew from Cincinnati to Dallas, did a week of shows in Dallas. So one truck drove down there to Dallas and then back to Cincy. And then during the Dallas show, another truck left from Cincy, went out to Vegas, where we flew from Dallas to Vegas and did a show in Vegas. And then I drove the Vegas truck home. And I think it was 3 days. That whole 2 weeks, I was sick the whole time. The truck to get back to Cincinnati from Dallas caught on fire just as we loaded the last piece of equipment in it.
It could have caught fire before you loaded it.
No, it was completely loaded, and the batteries caught fire underneath it. And then we all had to get behind it and push a 26-foot truck about 50 yards so we could get a tow truck behind it, and so we could get another truck there to offload what we just loaded onto it into another truck back to back, and it was absolutely horrible.
Well, I have to admit, I was really impressed during the Richard Leach show that we worked together. We were recording the show. We weren't doing live sound, but still, your approach was really thorough. I mean, you started by looking at the AC, where it was coming from, to make sure that we had enough electrical circuits for the gig. Even knowing that crew people dressed all in black was something I didn't know. You once told me that the way cables are run, not just trying not to have power cables and mic cables next to one another, but the way you coil them in a figure eight pattern makes a big difference.
Yeah.
Talk about that a little bit.
Well, I mean, it's from the ground up. Everything that is a live event, all you want to make sure is that your stuff doesn't fail. That's from ground up. So, like, if you're going to build a PA out, one of the first primary things is how much power do I need and where am I getting it from? How do I make sure that it's clean? Typically with me, it would be, a power distro or something like that where you're getting, 3 phases from the house. And then if you find out that lighting also is getting, power from the house, what are they using? Are they on my stuff? If they're on my stuff, there's no way. Like, I need something to get, I need to isolate my power somehow, with a transformer or something to keep from, because if you have some lighting dimmers on your power, the minute they're on full, everything sounds fine. The minute they start dimming it and choking your circuit, you're going to end up getting a hum. And it's terrible because if done really wrong, it will just kill you. It's just the most annoying thing.
Did you try to keep all your audio circuits on one phase?
Yeah, for smaller stuff, yes. For bigger stuff, I would need my own couple phases.
Coiling cables, that's something
Well, power straight away. If you want to have people at a live show look at you funny or the crew look at you funny or laugh or I don't know, throw something at you. Coil power. Go ahead, make a coil of power on the ground, especially if it's like your feeder or something. Go ahead and put that in a coil and see if someone doesn't like ream you for it. It's basically, if you make a coil of power cable, you're going to end up inducing a lot of like electromagnetic. You're going to end up basically creating something that, first off, is going to get super hot and it probably eventually pop a breaker if you're pushing it. And it's also going to introduce a lot of noise. It's just going to suck up everything around it.
It'd be like a giant heater coil, maybe.
Yeah, it's just bad. If we had something here that was sucking 20 amps out of a wall, if we had 2 20-amp circuits and we had something that was sucking 20 amps all the time, I could put a figure 8 cable on the ground, basically not a coil, so make a figure 8 out of it, next to a separate circuit that's pulling the same thing with a coil coil of cable, eventually that's going to heat up enough and it's going to end up being so inefficient that it'll pop the breaker. So the figure eight will keep you from getting a lot of noise in your lines, as well as keep you from being inefficient and popping it in case you get close.
Kind of like a humbucker pickup almost on a guitar.
Yeah, exactly. There's things like that. I would even figure eight any AC cable that's going to be laying near any audio cable at any point in time. And a lot of times on shows like this, that's everywhere. So any excess AC, I'd figure eight it. I'd even do that to audio cables. I do it to audio cables on stage just because a figure eight will unravel a lot easier if someone's carrying a mic around. They can just run away with it, and if it's figure eighted on the ground, it'll be just fine.
When I was Googling the figure eight cables, most people were talking about it in terms of it's so much easier to uncoil this way than when you have it coiled up. They weren't talking about the inductance issue, but they're saying it keeps it lower on the ground and it's easier to uncoil. Yeah. In the corporate shows, do they divide the mixers into front of house and monitor positions like they do at concerts, or were you doing both?
It depends. The only time a monitor mixer would be there is if there was a band. Mm-hmm. A lot of times the only thing that was fed to the stage during these things would be playback feeds. You wouldn't feed their voice back to them. What they'd get would be playback. So if they're like, listen to this song, then the song would play on stage so they can hear what it ends. Anything from a graphics PC or video playback, they'd get up there. Or if there's bands or VOs or things, but not the live mics on stage.
Well, I have a friend who's a mixer at the Grand Ole Opry, and he told me one time that they would actually record the band isolated tracks on a disc recorder during the rehearsal, and then in the time between the rehearsal and the show, they'd set up a snapshot mix on the console by playing everything back from the disc recorder. So then they'd have a snapshot mix they could recall with the touch of a button when the band stepped on stage. They do this also on the late night talk shows too. Do you ever use a technique like that, or did you ever use it when you were doing that?
No, I never had anything complicated enough to need to do that. I did save all my mixes, so it'd be in digital boards. The minute I would get to any reasonable point, you'd save along the way and save it. And once you get done for the day, or each person who gets up, if it's not saving the whole board for their mix, it's saving their EQ setting that you can just recall when you need it. But yeah, we'd save everything, and when that day came forward, you can just pull it up, recall the mix. And what's funny, the boards at this company were just riddled with all these other shows that you're never going to go back and use again. You're never going to have the same setup, but like all these settings from all these different shows, and like the names of them change typically on how it went. Like I know there's a couple of them in there. If anyone ever gets jobs there and they're diving through consoles, I have some in there that's like, please kill me. Worst show ever, I think, things like that, or won't be here tomorrow. See ya, suckers. Or
that's pretty cool. As corporate shows become more and more complicated, now you're talking about that they're using more pre-recorded elements. How do you queue up and play back pre-recorded elements at shows?
Well, we had instant replays. There's a couple different programs for the PC that we'd use too, but for the most part, if it was really playback heavy, audio playback-wise, audio cues, that responsibility would go away from the A1, the mixer, and go to a playback guy. So there were a couple shows where I was just playback and show up, and I had 2 instant replays. It's just a box with a grid of buttons on it, and whenever you push a button, it plays that sample. Now, those have kind of zero frills. They sound good. Push the button, plays out line level, good and hot. So then it's simple for the mixer. He just gets this and it just goes in. Typically what I would do is if I had something like that set up, you have 2 instant replays, one for music, one for the voice, send it to front of house, and he would typically have it on a ducking system. So I'd hit the music, his level would be set. And all this comes down beforehand. If a music's different level, I could adjust it in my box, or he could be ready and make notes that we know when it's this cue, music goes down by 3 dB to match the level and play out. So, you've rehearsed all these things, or at least know what you're up against.
Yeah, the ducking is like the sidechain limiter that we discussed in audio too, where the limiter's on the music, but it's looking at the voice, and every time the voice speaks, it ducks the music.
Yeah, it makes it real easy on the mixer too. If the mixer trusts the playback guy enough, he'll leave those channels open at all times, and once your cue gets called, you don't even need to tell the mixer to open any audio. He's got it open, and you run the music plays, run the VO, music drops, and the mixer can just stand there and just make sure everything kind of sounds good. So that was the one playback scenario there. Other than that, if it's just one mixer, it's an instant replay or PC sitting on top of your console, sitting on a doghouse or something, just playing things from there. And it ends up there's sometimes where there's so many cues so quick that you don't have enough hands, which is why you'd need a second person. But there's definitely times where they didn't have a budget to have an extra person fly out, and you're stuck there with music and VO plus the band playing or things like that, where you're doing all these funky mute things while trying to finagle a mouse on the screen to play an audio clip followed by a VO, and it can get a little hectic.
One of the projects I had the students do was to take corporate video and then EQ and level out all of the talking heads so that the loudness and the timbre of each person was more or less consistent. What problem does that create for you when you get a piece of video to use in a corporate show where the dialogue is like all over the place?
Oh, it bites. If you preview everything beforehand, you rehearse all the video rolls and you listen to them and you make notes, right? Because because if they're coming from all the same production house, then good. They're probably all the same. But if they're coming from all over the place, if one person wants to show this clip from something and then another person brought something else, they're all going to be all over the map. So you have to make notes on where your faders need to be and what EQ settings you have to have. And you need to change them each time or else you're just going to sound like a fool. So yeah, it causes issues, especially if it's the dialogue laid on top of like a music track that's already there. Then you clearly have to turn down the dialogue. You have to do something. I mean, you can compress it. You can try to squash it. It might level out if the dialogue's so hot, you might do that. But then you run the risk of sounding over compressed. And is that better than a massively drastic dynamic range that you don't really want from that? A lot of times on these productions, if they weren't like a big budget production, if they didn't have the money but they wanted these things, they do it for cheap and leave out the post-production for the audio. So then I would always go back to the production manager after that and say, what did you guys bid on this? Come on, we need to be able to do this better. This sounded terrible.
You also mentioned earlier that you were working shows where the equipment was not your gear but it was the house gear. So how often did that happen when you'd show up and surprise, you've never seen this gear before and you had to kind of figure out the way the console was laid out and make sure you could understand it and feel comfortable with it for the show?
Well, luckily, a lot of the stuff that I got to use when it was another place, it was fairly comparable. I mean, you've talked to them beforehand. You've been months in planning to get the stuff going. So
because you could look it up online and
check
it out.
If you really were worried about it, get the manual, figure it out. But honestly, that's the one part of it that I really enjoyed. It was a pharmaceutical company, but it was in the same place as the Golden Globes the day after the Golden Globes. So we got there the night before and got to be in Beverly Hilton during the Golden Globes and had rooms that overlooked the red carpet. Actually, I think you could see a couple of them on E when they were going down the red carpet. There was a bunch of guys in black shirts hanging out of a window shouting. But then that room was the Midas console. It's like, well, sweet, great, I get a Midas console. Like, oh, I'm excited. But you never got junk. You made sure you didn't get junk because, it's your reputation too. So whatever it took to make sure that you got something that was right and served the purpose as well, you did it. And I mean, you develop your own preference too. And if it's not your gear and it's from somewhere else,
Yeah, it still makes it a little bit uncomfortable because, you're used to things being in certain places, especially like you were talking about earlier, the scenario where you have to make a whole lot of quick moves. And if suddenly all those buttons are in different places, there's another step of mental thought that has to go into it. But I think one really big difference between the studio work like you and I are doing and the corporate theater shows is that in the corporate theater shows, you really only have one chance to get it right. There are no take twos. Yeah. So I suppose that with the CEOs and other corporate executives, actors, musicians, all participating in front of media and the shareholders, there's quite a bit of pressure not to make any mistakes.
Oh, yeah. And honestly, if you've got anxiety issues and you can't get them under wraps, that is not going to be the place for you. Or you'll be able to figure out how to deal with the pressure of it. And the first time, I'm sure it's the first time you do anything live, but especially when you do anything live at a large level, there's always that bit of pre-show pressure where, you're acting cool, you know everything's fine, but there's this little bit in your gut that goes, what if, and then insert like disaster scenario that you're running through your head, like, did I cover all my bases? Did I replace all my batteries? Is the power right? Is that hum gone? And there's so many different things. And yeah, you only get one chance to do it right, but once it starts rolling and once things start going, you don't have a chance to worry about how anxious you are or if things might go wrong. They just go. And if something blows up, if there is a problem, you kind of hit that, not really panic mode, but you have to think quick. How do I fix this now? And if I can't fix it right now, how do I make it look like it's fixed temporarily until I can fix it?
Jeff Maxwell once said, the day before he does a live production sound gig, he's always playing out in his head, okay, what could possibly go wrong? Yeah. What's my plan B or my fallback position?
We've had times, this was a show in San Diego, and 45 minutes before doors, we notice that half the lighting rig goes out and pieces of my PA drop, and there's this funny noise coming from backstage, like this thing. It was like real eerie, it's just this squeal. And we're like, this is not good. The client's there, he's like, guys, are we okay? And we're like, we don't know. We'll be straight up with you, but let us figure out what's going on. And this was one of those clients that nothing went wrong ever. You don't have problems. Problems don't exist here, and if they do, they better be fixed before I find out about them. And for something to be like that in front of our client, we're like, oh, this isn't good. Like maybe it's just flip a switch and it's fixed, but already that's not good. And as it turns out, we had dropped 2 legs of power. So that squeal we were hearing from backstage was a lighting dimmer not getting all the power and the fan trying to run. It was just shaking. And that was bad. So we literally, like where we should have been showing, loads upon loads of power coming out these legs, we pull them out of the floor and I drop my meter in it. and it literally was like 0.9 volts or something. I'm like, oh no, like this is bad. So then you think, okay, well, how long is this session? What's going on in it? How much do we really need? How many people are going to be here? So we sent our client back. I'm like, we need to know attendance, where they're going to sit. We might get rid of tables. We don't know exactly what's going on, but we need our plan B. Plan A was make this power start up again. So in 45 minutes, we ran around, figured out the power was completely dead in there. We needed, I think, 3-phase 200 amp. The nearest drop of that was like 200 feet away. And we had eaten up all the feeder. We couldn't get to that without having a rental company come in and bring more to us. So the first call was, hey guys, called a local lighting company, as fast as you can, bring me 200 feet of feeder. Then what we then started to do, as everything's color-coded, and luckily we color-coded all the power on the floor and labeled everything, we then started to plug only the essentials, repatch only the essentials into the one phase that we had power.
It sounds like a moon landing or something like that.
It was horrible. So we get all our essentials up. We figure out what the attendance is, make sure that there's only enough seats for them, and put those seats right where you could hear them and see what we've got. And so the stage was lit well, no special lighting, no nothing. Lit fine. Everyone could hear it. The projectors, everything would run. But there were no moving lights. There were no big, bright, crazy colors on our set pieces. No, nothing like that. It was just a no frills, get it up and make it work. It still looked good, and our client's client, the actual company who put this thing on, noticed no change. But this was 45 minutes before doors, which really only gave us an hour to figure out, hey, how come nothing's working, and how do we fix this? And literally it was 5 minutes before show, the feeder showed up. So directly after that show, I think we had like half an hour before the next one to repatch everything, run 200 feet of feeder over to the other room to patch in our power and get it back up and running. But yeah, those are the nights that you get done, go get dinner, and everyone drinks entirely too much.
Wow. My favorite engineer of all time, Tom Dowd, has been described by people who knew him as the most positive person they ever met. And that's the way I would describe you as well. Do you think that a positive attitude has been helpful in your career?
Yeah, to be able to have someone, the most high-maintenance person you ever dealt with, call you whatever, up and down, that's not even justified. If you can sit there and understand that it's not really your problem and get through it, do your job well, the people that matter are going to be the ones that notice that. Typically, you're hired by a production company to do a show for their client. So if their client is going off on you for something that's not right, or is just having a bad day or something, and you're able to smile through it, get through it, or turn the situation positive, then you look good to your client, to the production company, who understands where you're coming from. So you might not do another show for that person again, for their client, but you'll definitely look good in the eyes of the production company. If you do your job well, cover all your bases, and just make sure that you're not stepping on other people's feet, even though you might want to sometimes, you got to keep the big picture in mind. Don't mess up the job. Make sure everybody's cool with you. Then you'll be fine.
Adam, thanks for enlightening us about corporate theater, live mixing, and all that entails. It's an audio career that many people don't even think about, but if you don't mind heavy lifting, high pressure, long hours, problem solving, never being home, and dressing all in black, it might be very rewarding. Thanks again.
Hey, it pays better than rock and roll.
There you go. Thanks. Yep.